Start talking. And thanks again for doing this. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's 12:15 Central Standard Time here in Austin, Texas. I am joined by Doug Lewin, the president of Stoic Climate and Energy. Doug is an expert professionally and personally in so much of what's going on in the breakdown of Texas energy and power over the last couple of weeks. Doug, how are you? How is the family?
We're doing okay. We had some damage in our house. We're cleaning it up, and I think like all of us, trying to get over the collective trauma we experienced as a state. 5 days without running water and all that. But all things considered, we're doing just fine. Thanks for asking. How about you, Joseph?
Well, we were out of power for a couple of moments at the very beginning. I think because we live close to a fire station, we kept our power most of the time. But our pool basically became a community asset. 8 different families were taking buckets into my pool and using it to flush their toilets. So the last time I did that, I was in Iraq in 2007. So let's just jump right into it. Why is it? And for those viewers that are watching, I want to remind you this is live across YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Drop in with your questions, drop in with your comments. Like I say, Doug is an expert of this, and we're lucky to have him here today. So it's going to be in 3 parts. We're going to talk a little bit about how we got to now. Then we really want to go in depth on what happened with the Texas Legislature over the last 4 or 5 days. You've been practically live tweeting it, and I recommend that anybody check out your tweets. Doug Lewin Energy is your handle. And then thirdly, we want to talk about steps going forward. So just real quick, how did we get to now? How did this happen?
Yeah, Joseph, it's obviously complicated, and anything that tries to make it too simplistic is going to miss the whole point. But I think just for the purposes of conversation, to try to boil it down to its essence and as simple as I can, I think there were failures on a couple of fronts that really sort of stick out to me. One is, as a state, as a society, but particularly in Texas, we have systematically ignored climate science. And that is a real problem. And it's not just a problem for this event. And this gets into sort of a second failure, which is related to the first, which is the failure of planning, and the failure to so my company name is Stoic Climate and Energy. I've been influenced a lot by a man named Ryan Holiday, who lives here in the Austin area out at Bastrop. And he talks a lot about, Stoic philosophy, and in his books, that the Stoics always had this practice, right, of doing sort of a pre-mortem, right? Imagine the worst that
what would happen if something bad happened.
Yeah, I'm talking to a military guy. You know this, right? I mean, the military does this all the time. What ERCOT did, and I want to be clear, like, I know a lot of people that work at ERCOT. I am not like a lot of people trying to say this is all on them. There's failures across the board. Some of those I've tried to analyze my own role as somebody as an energy expert and what I could have done better. And I'd welcome that conversation in the next 40 minutes. I think we all need to be doing that. So I want to be clear. I'm not saying ERCOT's the bad guy. They did this wrong. They're the reason everybody suffered. That is not what I'm saying. I want to be real clear. However, they did have mistakes. They did have problems, and we've got to understand what those are to make sure that we don't repeat
And
them.
in this conversation, what I think viewers will be interested to learn is if we can break down the difference between mistakes that were made, like they had a choice and they didn't do this, or as the director, I believe, said during his testimony, hey, I wanted to do this, but I couldn't do this because the rules that you all set up for me. Can you break that down for just a second?
Yeah. Let's come back to that in 1 second. I do want to finish this point about planning and about pre-mortems. What ERCOT does is they do twice a year, they do something called a seasonal assessment of resource adequacy. It's been in the news a lot. You might have even heard that term. It's bizarre to me that like so many people are talking about this obscure report that I and maybe a few other 100 people read when it came out.
Well, that's why we're lucky to have you on here today talking about it.
And it's not like something that like when I read it, I went, oh my God, they're wrong. Again, this is not to say they're wrong and I was right. There was a collective failure here of a whole community of people involved in this, and we've all got to analyze that. But what they did was they looked at, what's the normal, what does a normal season look like? And then what does an extreme season look like? Okay. And in their extreme scenario, they said, we're going to go we're going to have 10 gigawatts more of energy needed. We can talk about what all these units mean, but basically, let's just put that in percentage, like 20% more demand than we would need in a usual year. And that was one extreme scenario.
Extreme weather event.
Yeah, an extreme weather event, and instead of 58 gigawatts, we need 68. So, 15, 20% more demand on the system. That's one scenario. Here's another scenario. Wind drops down to 2 gigawatts, where normally it's running at like 7. That's one. Here's another scenario. Gas drops down to like 40 gigawatts of capacity instead of the 50 or 55 we usually have. There were like 4 or 5 of these they looked at. What they never did was combine all those and say, what if all of that happens at one time? What if gas drops, wind drops, demand goes up? What if all these things happen at once? And that is, in fact, what happened. And so there is a sort of a failure of planning there, which I think is tied also to this failure of taking into account climate change. And I want to be clear, scientists do not yet agree on whether or not any one weather event can be tied to climate change, and even whether or not polar vortex is strengthened by climate change. There's not what they call high confidence on that question. They put it at low confidence, which for you and me would still mean something like we'd want to take very seriously, right? If somebody said, I have low confidence that you have this physical, disease or something, you would go to a doctor right away and get that checked out and try to do what you could to mitigate it. So I want to be clear, this is a lot of what sort of climate deniers will often use against us, is saying, oh, because it's not proven, it's not true. That's not the case. And the data points from this last event strengthen the case tremendously that climate change is driving these extreme events. And even if it turns out that it wasn't, let's look at what are we planning for this summer? What is the next seasonal assessment of resource adequacy? You know what it's going to say? It's going to take an average of the last decade or two and say, this is what we expect for this summer. Do you, Joseph Kopser, have confidence? Yeah.
So for viewers that are not, policy wonks or energy wonks, I think I want to try to feed back what I heard you just say. One of the planning failures we have in this is that we've been using the last 100 years per se, or 150 years to get our ups and downs. What you're advocating for going forward, which is already part of the remedy that we're talking about, is just saying, hey, don't look at the last 100 years. Let's just look at the last 10 years of the ups and downs. Because I know, as living here in 2011, that we had that super freeze in 2011, but then we nearly burned the state down in the summertime with 100 days over 100 degrees. So is that part of what you're talking about, just reducing the time frame?
There's that. And I also think you really can't rely on the past as a predictor anymore. And this is what gets so difficult. Even the last 10 years is probably going to be inadequate. Do any of us think that this summer is not going to be the hottest summer on record? I mean, I think 3 of the last 5 years have been the hottest summers. So call it a 60 to 80% chance this is going to be the hottest. So if you average the last 10, you're undershooting it.
Well, so I want to cover another topic real quick so that by the time we're done here, by the top of the hour, we've covered a number of different issues important to folks. So much has talked in this last 10 days about the supply. The supply broke down, but there's also a lot to be discussed about the demand and how people change their habits either in the moment or how they can change them long term. I know a lot of homes that kept everything on that did have electricity, everything on, they heated a normal amount, all their electronics going, they lit up like a Christmas tree. So talk a little bit about the demand side that we need to be thinking differently.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. This is where I spent a bulk of my career, both as director of the South Central Partnership for Energy Efficiency as a resource, a leading energy efficiency organization in Texas and Oklahoma, and then as head of regulatory affairs for CLEAResult, which is a company that does utility energy efficiency programs in 40 states and provinces. So this is something I know a lot about and have thought a lot about. And so let's talk a little bit about what happened with what we were just talking about with planning. And don't worry about the units of gigawatts. We can get into what that means, but if you don't understand those terms, you don't actually need to know them yet. The basic point is the normal February load would be 58 gigawatts. Doesn't really matter what the unit is, the number is 58. The extreme planning scenario that ERCOT put out there was 68. What we would have hit had we not gone to outages was 77. That is 2 more than the all-time summer peak. That is an astounding number, and a number that nobody thought, I don't think anybody really thought was possible. What does that number tell us? It tells us that our buildings are not well insulated. We
Yeah.
have very poor building stock. We have not prepared for these kinds of events. If we decide as a state, we have a couple different ways we could go. We could just say we're going to weatherize all the power plants and just hope the supply side of the equation solves the problem. I would represent to you that anybody that tells you that any one solution will solve this, I would be very skeptical of that person.
Right.
We
Well,
are going to need.
Yeah, that's where I want to jump in real quick because you said something that's perked my interest. So at USTomorrow, which is one of the partners of this event today, we are focused like a laser beam on workforce readiness. Give an idea, and maybe you don't have the exact number, but just the trajectory of the amount of jobs we could create in the state of Texas if we go back and look at the infrastructure of reducing that demand by going back in, weatherizing, winterizing, whatever word you want to use, to make homes, make buildings more able to resist the cold and therefore reduce demand. What does that look like in terms of jobs?
It's massive. It's massive. Right now, there are, before the pandemic, there were 170,000 workers in energy efficiency in Texas. 250,000 advanced energy jobs. 2/3 of those are in energy efficiency. That energy efficiency number is more than those working directly in oil and gas in the state.
Let's say that again. I love this quote: energy efficiency jobs versus oil and gas jobs. And by the way, if people see a downturn in oil and gas and they're divesting of interest or reducing jobs, there's an opportunity to move some of that work perhaps over into this energy efficiency side. So say those numbers again.
Yeah, in energy efficiency before the pandemic, I believe the exact number was 167,000 jobs. This is in a report by the Texas Advanced Energy Business Alliance, and maybe we can bring that one up to show people it's a great report they do annually on the number of jobs. 35,000 jobs in wind and solar in Texas. A lot of jobs in electric vehicles. I think we're up to 7,000 or 8,000, and that's growing really fast. So these sectors are all hot. In fact, the fastest growing job sector in America are solar installers and wind technicians, but the core of the clean energy economy are energy efficiency workers. These are construction workers building green buildings. These are plumbers doing water efficiency work. We're plumbers going all over the state fixing up homes. Let's insulate those pipes. Let's make sure we're reducing
I just want to pause because you got me smiling ear to ear.
Yeah.
If we insulate our homes better, we stay warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer because we're keeping that air conditioning in the house. That's why I'm fired up about the idea of this being a win-win opportunity to rebuild. And oh, by the way, we need more plumbers. We need more electricians. To your point, we need to bury a lot of these pipes deeper so they're not susceptible to freezing. Keep going on this evangelism of jobs. I'm loving it.
Let's talk about HVAC contractors, right? I mean, the heating and cooling systems in our homes are obviously the biggest pull for demand. So we need to have more efficient HVAC systems. Of course, insulation installers. We were just talking about insulation. So you're absolutely right, Joseph. There's a term that I've heard a lot in the last few weeks, probably more in the last couple of weeks that I've heard in the years before: passive survivability. Right? In a catastrophic case like this, where you lose the grid for days on end, can you survive in your house? Does the temperature go from 68 or whatever you had before down to 32? Or does it go from 68 to 50? 50 is still terribly uncomfortable, but there's a big difference between 50 and 32, as a lot of people experienced a couple weeks ago.
As we learn, tragically, it can be the difference between life and death.
Correct.
So I'm going to ask Nora to just tag Texas Association of Business and Carlton Schwab and the Texas Economic Development Council in this thread. Because again, if they're not here watching it live, it'll be available for the recording later on. Because again, circling back to the idea of jobs and the winterization or just the weatherization of homes, we have a real opportunity. What about other things that people can be doing to reduce demand? I know there's talk about people wanting now to have rain collection units set by their house. They're talking about solar installation, tapping into new savings plans with their energy producer. What are some of those things and what do they look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll just a quick personal story. I mean, during this thing, you were talking about how your pool became, the source of flush water, as it were, for a lot of folks in your neighborhood, a neighbor down the street has a rain barrel and was kind enough to let me get some of his rainwater, which we were able to use for dishwashing when we had no dishes left. We should all, I mean, I was laughing with him as I was filling water out of his rain barrel that we're all preppers now.
Yeah.
I'm going to get a rain barrel now, right? I mean, we all got to be prepared for these kinds of things. But let's talk about some of the other ones.
But before you do that, though, I want to bring up the same point. You know, we didn't used to have a problem with people falling, or what was passive? What was your term? Passive
survivability. Passive survivability.
Passive survivability wasn't a thing to the early, settlers of Texas, no matter where they came from, because none of them were on the grid. They had to provide their own food. They had to provide their own energy, whether it be animal provided energy or human powered. And then the water came from underneath their feet or in the local stream. So keep going with what your point was about the rain barrel and such.
And speaking of the early Texans, it is Texas Independence Day, so happy Texas Independence Day. On some of those things, and let's talk about independence. Let's talk about energy independence, right? People can be putting solar panels on their roofs. They can get energy storage systems to put into their garage. There were a lot of folks that were posting on Twitter pictures of how they were powering their homes with their electric vehicles. I could be getting some of the numbers. This isn't like particularly my area of expertise, but as I understand it, on some of the bigger cars, take a Rivian or some of the Ford F-150 electrics that are coming out, or the Chrysler minivan that's now electric. The batteries on these, somebody's going to check me later and tell me I'm wrong, and then I'll be smarter. But I'll risk failure here to get smarter later. I think those batteries are somewhere around 100 to 140 kilowatt hours. My home, on an average day, uses 30 to 40 kilowatt hours. I don't have a particularly efficient house, but it's not terrible either. Call it like 30 kilowatt hours a day. You could actually run your house on an electric vehicle if you have the right technology. And if the utility regulations allow for that. Those are big questions and policy issues we're going to need to deal with. But you could actually power your home with your electric vehicle. I also want to really highlight, those are some things I think everybody's looking into. I think I saw something Sunrun had posted on Twitter that they're a leading sort of solar installer, and they do a lot of solar and storage systems, that their call volume was up something like 300 or 400% in the week after the storm.
The last Saturday, not this, but the one before, watching Texas basketball, the marketing team for that company was so smart that the commercials that were coming on were for that. They did an hour-long infomercial, and good on them. But let me go back to the batteries for just a second, because this is often discussed, and I want to get your take on it, which is that people say that long-term, our reliance on batteries will do greater harm because we're digging and mining to find those precious metals at a rate that we don't even have them. I think the expression I heard, I think I heard it on a podcast recently that Bill Gates, I think, even made reference to this, that there's not enough battery capacity in the world to even run Tokyo for 10 days if Tokyo went all electric. Do you have any thoughts on that, about what we need to do about, this idea of the miracle battery, or what we could do in battery technologies and how that plays in and the impact it has on mining?
So I have some thoughts, but I will confess I'm fairly shallow in this area, and I'm not really a chemistry guy. My understanding is a couple things. One, some of that is overblown. There are large, amounts of lithium. The mining of it isn't pretty, and we need to, get better at supply chains and cleaning that up. There's cadmium, which is a problem in there too. But there are chemistries being developed that are alternatives to those. And I also would say, like, as far as the bulk, grid system goes, you don't have to have all lithium ion. There's vanadium flow batteries. There's what are they? Sodium sulfur batteries, like the one that's out in far west Texas, the Bob, they call it, the big old battery that's 4 megawatts. I think Japan has some of those. There's pumped hydro. I don't know if we could use our lakes here for that, but basically the idea is when the wind is blowing really hard, you move the water. And then when the wind dies down, you let the water go back out.
West Virginia, the world's largest energy storage, is doing exactly that, pumping the water up and down, and they can power almost the whole East Coast. So only a few minutes left here. Let's pivot for a couple of minutes and talk now about the legislature. So some of the quotes that came out of those hearings were phenomenal. Your streaming coverage on Twitter was helpful for people that want to know what's going on, that maybe don't speak the language. One of my favorite quotes, and this is loosely paraphrased, which is, yeah, things went wrong, but you made us, So you can change us to fix these things. What happened? Was there any drama? Was there anything surprising? And what do people need to know going forward, whether they're Texans or not?
There was a lot of drama. There was a lot of, finger pointing and blaming and deflecting. I think, Evan Smith of the Texas Tribune put that famous Spider-Man picture of everybody pointing at each other. And there was a lot of that going on. And I think, frankly, that's part of the problem. And I hope that the legislature will deal with this. There's some talk of consolidating agencies and making one super agency. I don't think you need to do that. I think you need agencies that focus on what they focus on and do that well. And obviously there were failures within some of those agencies, and we could talk about that more, but I think you absolutely need better coordination across those agencies. And it's not just PUC and ERCOT. It's not just PUC, ERCOT, Railroad Commission. You need Water Development Board. You need TxDOT. You need the State Energy Conservation Office. You got, Texas Department of Agriculture. We could be using, ag as an energy resource. There's all sorts of different ways. We need to have better coordination across the agencies. So that was something that stood out to me. Whether or not that stood out to the legislators, as agencies are saying, well, we did this over here, but we don't have any control over that. And then the next one says, well, we did this over here, but we don't have any control over that. And then the questions come up, well, were you talking to each other? Well, every once in a while we talk. We have these meetings where we talk sometimes. That clearly is not adequate, and that absolutely needs to be addressed.
Well, so a friend of ours, a colleague in common, Tommy Tynes, who is also in the regulatory space, he's an attorney, but he was on the Texas Legislature on staff, similar time, I think, to you. Recently, he put a piece up with CleanTex, of which he and I are board members. I'm the chair of the advisory board, kind of breaking it all down. So there's a lot of experts that are out there, and I'll ask Nora to drop a link to that into the chat as well. But so there's a lot of experts that are out there, but you worked in both the House and Senate side, I think, for about 5 years. What level of confidence do you have that with all the other distractions of COVID, it's only a 6-month legislature every 2 years? Like, where's the change going to come from? Who, or said in a different way, who needs to be leading the change?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those cases where the leadership really needs to come from below. I hope that so many of you listening and you'll talk with your friends and neighbors and coworkers. We all need to be involved in this. And this is what I was saying, earlier. I think we all need to examine what role we played. Did we pay attention to this? As I've talked to a lot of people about over the last few weeks, nobody pays attention to the grid until it's gone. Let's all pay attention to our energy systems. Let's pay attention to the underinvestment we've made as a state in energy efficiency and in demand response and in solar and storage. I think there is leadership at the legislature, but I think like anything else at the legislature, there's that apocryphal story of FDR. I don't know whether it actually happened or whether it's just apocryphal, where he said to some advocate that was talking to him one day, "You've convinced me, now make me do it." Like we need people to get involved. And if we sort of go back to the other crises in our lives and the other things going on, and we don't sort of stay engaged and talk to our elected officials, there's always going to be a tendency in policymaking bodies to do the minimum and move on. And if we do that, I guarantee you we will have more problems like this in the future. Whether they'll be as spectacular and catastrophic, I don't know. But given what's going on with climate change, and I think that that's really important too, right? It should no longer be taboo to talk about climate change. Is one of the first things that happened in that Senate hearing was one of the members brought up climate change and was quickly sort of shut down. It's like, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what happened 2 weeks ago. Well, what happened 2 weeks ago was at least partially a story of extreme weather. So yeah. I think I have confidence that things will get fixed to the degree the public stays engaged. The public's engaged right now. Members are hearing from their constituents. If that continues, they will take this on and deal with it in a comprehensive, holistic, and effective way. If that public pressure drops, they will do the minimum and move on.
Yeah. Well, again, we're live right now. So if you have any comments, questions, or observations for Doug, go ahead and drop them in the line. So let's turn just for a little bit about going forward with how the legislature works. Are these changes that you think people can see this year? Will it affect their utility bills this summer with the heat? Like, what is the timeline you anticipate coming out of this?
So the timeline for bills, the session is constitutionally mandated to be 140 days. So I believe the last day is May 30th, May 31st, somewhere right in there. There will be special sessions. We know that because the census has not delivered the data that the legislature needs in order to redistrict. So they've got to draw, congressional lines. They've got to draw state House and Senate lines, the state Board of Education lines. They cannot do that before the end of May. So they will be back. Speaker Phelan said in an interview Sunday morning that I'm quoting him, there could be 1, 2, or 3 special sessions, and that they will probably, this part I'm not quoting, but I'm paraphrasing, that they will probably take on energy issues during those special sessions. There's a separate question that I think is really important about people's energy bills. There's more we don't know right now than what we know. I want to be clear about that. There's a lot that's unclear right now, including whether or not the federal government will step in and help, whether or not the legislature will step in and use either rainy day funds or some kind of a method like securitization to do bonds and spread these costs out over time, or to take some of those costs away. There's a lot that is not.
Can I just interrupt on that? Because this is just blowing my mind. So we've set up a regulatory market that is actually very hands-off. So we deregulated 20 plus years ago, meaning it's a market-based system. And if I understand correctly, the reason why some people got these 5-digit $10,000 electrical bills are because they were using a variable cost or variable payment system. And then the state rushed in. I heard state leaders like the governor come in and say, we're not going to have them pay that. That's not going to be paid. We're going to put a moratorium on that, cease and desist kind of a deal. But doesn't that absolutely fly in the face of 20 years ago setting up a free market system? Like, I don't want to say, and I don't want to be too draconian to say, look, you either have one way or the other. Either it's a regulated market or it's not a regulated market. If spikes go high, then costs are passed on to the customer, or if customers aren't having to pay, then we're all paying as a society, meaning it's a regulated market. My mind is blown. Help me figure that one out.
So I'm going to answer that question, and then I want to make sure we leave time to talk about the gas side of the equation, because for the 40% of Texans that get gas to their home, that is a fully regulated wholesale cost, fully passed through, plus a markup. So let's come back to that in a minute, but I don't want to neglect your question. So there is this question of gritty customers. They're the one. There may have been another company with even less customers, but they were passing on wholesale electric costs directly to
Gritty
their customers.
Is literally the name of the company, GRIDDY.
And they're owned by Macquarie, by the way, the big Australian company. So that's kind of interesting. I don't think that's really been talked about enough, that they do have a corporate parent. Anyway, so there were about 37,000 customers on that. I could be wrong on this, but my understanding is Gritty actually did pay their bills at ERCOT. I could be wrong about this. They may have declared Chapter 11, but here's the bigger, there's very few customers on that plan. And we can talk about that plan, but I actually think it's more interesting to talk about the other, 7 million, 8 million customers in Texas. Here's what's going on right now. On Friday, as the legislature was still in hearings, ERCOT posted a market notice and said, we are short $2.1 billion. ERCOT basically ends up acting as an exchange where buyers and sellers meet up, and they can sort of, collect the money, pass it on to the others. It's an exchange or a market, right? And the sellers had put in their invoices, and the buyers came back and said, I'm greatly oversimplifying this, and I'm sure people that are real ERCOT experts are cringing right now. But
the suppliers are the power producers.
Correct.
And the buyers are the electric utility companies.
No, they're what, so that's a little different, and this is where it gets really complicated. They're what would be called, and this is a term of art, load serving entities. So that would be
load serving entities. You can't say that with a straight face.
I know, LSEs. And so there's so many acronyms. There's even one Queasy. There's a Queasy as an acronym.
But I'm load serving trying to follow all this, but keep going.
Load serving entities are retail electric providers. So if you live in Houston or Dallas or Corpus or Laredo, you probably have Reliant or TXU or Gritty. Those are there's about 100 of them. the biggest are Reliant, TXU. Those are load serving entities. Austin Energy and CPS are municipally owned utilities. They serve load. They have customers. So it's basically whoever generates a bill. Co-ops are load serving entities. So those load serving entities are required to pay for the power that was produced. They were short $2.1 billion. Okay. So let me just play this out. ERCOT has 800 million in collateral. They applied towards that. So now they're down 1.3 billion. Yesterday, 345 million more was short. So they're down about 1.65 billion. So what happens to that in the absence, and this phrase is very important, in the absence of some government intervention, they do, and this is another term of art, they do what is called market uplift. It sounds so nice. It's uplifting. They're just uplift. Market uplift means everybody else pays. That means everybody else, that cost is socialized across everybody else. Now,
did you say the S word? Did you say socialized?
That's right.
Oh,
that's what it is. Yeah. That those costs are socialized across the system. And you had a lot of companies testifying at the hearing that customers will see no increase in their bills. And that is true to an extent. If you are with one of the larger retail electric providers, your next month bill probably won't be more, and it might even be less because your demand is cut off for so long.
Yeah, your power was off. Yeah.
Your power went off, so you used less. That's an issue in and of itself, because usually they'll automatically estimate. The system will see that as an error, and they'll just add on an estimate. They've got but they can't do that, right? I mean, people would be out in the street with pitchforks if they charge them for the energy they didn't use during a blackout. So they're not going to do that. They're going to fix that. They're in the process of fixing that problem. But the bigger problem here is once that is uplifted to the market, once that is socialized across everybody in the market, eventually that makes its way into higher costs for all consumers again, in the absence of some government intervention. And I do want to focus for just a minute, and then we can come back to this, Joseph, if there's anything confusing there. But I want to make sure we don't lose the thread on gas customers. Gas customers, so at the hearing, CenterPoint, actually that morning, I think the morning they testified, CenterPoint filed, I believe it's an 8K is what it's called. It's like a document with the SEC where they've got to divulge when things are going on that are extraordinary. And as much as I understand this, and they, in their filing, they said, we paid in that 1 week $2.5 billion more for gas than we were expecting to pay. Something, forgive me if I'm getting some of the details wrong, but that's that. And we could put a correction if I got anything wrong. If anybody's listening to this and I got it wrong, like everybody else, I'm learning. This is quite an overwhelming set of things to try to get your head around. So if I got something wrong, tell us, we'll correct the record. But my understanding is and we can link to that, that filing they made with the SEC, $2.5 billion at the hearing. And they have about 1.5 million, maybe 2 million customers in the Houston area, gas customers, CenterPoint's electric and gas. Atmos Energy, which is the largest gas company in North Texas, they serve most of Dallas and Fort Worth. They were questioned by some of the senators, and they said ours is probably about the same, about $2.5 billion. And the president of that company said, we are going to have this discussion at the Railroad Commission is where this will play out as to whether or not we spread those costs over 10, 15, or 25 years, he said, which means people will be paying for this into the 2040s. And by the way, if you live in an apartment right now and have all electric, and next year you're moving up in the world, you go buy a house and you got a gas hookup at that house, my understanding is, and again, if I'm wrong, correct me, but my understanding is you would then be paying for that for the next 20 years, even though you didn't have gas in your house. Because again, that's socialized across all customers.
Well, let's go to Lee's point. So Lee wrote in and basically said that he was a giddy customer and then got off of it as soon as everything went sideways. And so he had cheap electricity before. And then when it got expensive, whoop, he stopped. Isn't really what he did the model of what we should have been doing, all of us, on both the demand and the supply side?
So I appreciate the question, and it's interesting and it's complicated. I do not think, and I don't see how anybody could come out of this event and think that having customers exposed to real time, and this is, by the way, I did want to just slightly correct something you said, Joseph. You said it's a variable rate. There's something called a variable rate. This is a real time rate. That's what this is. Whatever the cost, a real time rate is different than a variable rate. A variable rate is one that might move month to month. There's about 350,000 of those customers in the competitive market. Those folks are going to see higher costs going forward. I don't see any other way. But they're not going to get $5,000, $9,000 bills, that kind of thing, because they're not exposed to the real time market which, by the way, again, on the gas side, even though it's fully regulated, customers are exposed to that. Customers just don't know it or have any way to deal with it. So I think that's something that's got to be dealt with too. On the gritty question, I don't think customers should be exposed to real-time wholesale prices. I think there were 37,000 people on there. Maybe your questioner, but he's listening to this conversation, he's more plugged in. But I think the vast majority of those people didn't realize what was happening, and many of them got stuck with bills. I don't see how we could come out of this and say that's okay. There have to be more regulations, more sort of guardrails put around that. But I also think that with so much of these discussions, there's a baby in a bathwater thing here, right? Like they're having some market signal that customers could respond to. And I want to be clear, when I say customers could respond to, I mean like in an automated way. I don't mean like you've got to sit there and like watch the energy markets and dial back when prices go high. There's a company out there called Octopus Energy, and I'm sure there's others, and I hope afterwards people will put others in the chat because I want to learn about these companies. This is one I happen to know about. British company, they've got retail customers in Texas. They do some wholesale real-time pass-through stuff. They announced after this, they're just going to eat that cost. The customers will pay 12 cents or whatever. But their whole thing is, let's get heat pumps, let's get electric hot water heaters, your pool pump. You were talking about your pool, Joseph. Like, let's have a program whereby automatically, right, an automatic system where you've set it up beforehand that when a price comes through, that you have a sort of a smart system in your home that sees that price and dials back your usage at that time in ways that aren't even perceptible to you.
Changing behaviors by getting data. So, I mean, is that the best way you describe it?
And making it automatic, making it where no, because I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. People are like, well, customers aren't going to spend all this time doing this stuff. You don't have to spend any time doing that. You just have to tell me what you're willing to let me cycle off in a way you want. Let me ask you this. During the night of the outages, we were all over the state heating water. Think of all the hot water heaters all throughout the state at 1:30 in the morning. What if we could have cycled half of those off? And just for a half an hour. So when you woke up in the morning, you still had hot water. Did you need your water to be boiling all night long? Or could you have tolerated? And let me ask you something else. What if somebody said, I'll pay you to let you to let me cycle your hot water heater? You'll never have less hot water, and I'm going to pay you. How do you like that? I'll sign up.
Yeah. So, in fact, there is a link I'll try to remember to send it to later on where Michael Weber actually gave a TED style talk about how we change power and energy as a service as opposed to just shipping it out. In other words, much of what the research that they're doing at the Pecan Street Project here in Austin, Texas, is to say, well, wait a minute, what if the electric company or the utility company had a vested interest in you having the most energy efficient refrigerator or HVAC or hot water heater so that it was a partnership instead of just a one-way deal? Because obviously the one-way deal showed some weaknesses. So we're getting ready to end here on time. So I just want to go back to a point. I think I saw USTomorrow was asking that my executive director, what can the average citizen do to keep track and advocate for the changes needed? What are, is the ledge, by the way, the be all end all for this? And then what infrastructure impacts do you want to see go forward?
Yeah, so how can people stay involved? I think one of the most important ways to stay involved is to really get to know your state rep, your state senator, your congressman or woman. What's that?
Sorry, I just had to say Vicki Goodwin.
Vicki Goodwin is, yes, and they will, and almost all of them will do regular, whether it's some kind of coffee chat on Facebook or something like that. Like, go to those. Tell them what your concerns are. Ask them how your concerns are being met. I think that is the most important way to stay involved. And it's what I try to do, and it's hard. Like it's hard to do that. We're all busy, but I think look, we get the government that we make, right? It's our participation.
The people
is not only a determining factor, but the determining factor. I know it sounds silly and cliche and like junior high or something, but it really is true. And they will listen to you if you you'd be surprised how few people show up to these things. You might be on an afternoon, chat with your state senator that's got 30 or 40 people on it or less. Like, show up. That is the most important.
Well, I love it because at USTomorrow, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is to get people around the table to talk about issues that are not as polarizing, like workforce and workforce readiness. So when we go back to that point you made earlier about all the jobs in, energy efficiency, regardless if you're talking winter or summer, energy efficiency just keeps your house more livable, especially in the passive situations. If you lose power and you lose water. So by the way, Tommy Tynes jumped in there and said that Doug Lewin is the man, and I have to.
Tommy Tynes is the man. No. Tommy, you mentioned some of his background. He worked at the PUC, he worked for Tesla. I'm looking forward to catching up with Tommy. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about. Good to see you, Tommy.
Excellent. Okay. Any last thoughts before we wind down?
So let me say one thing that I didn't say throughout this, and I think needs to be brought up in any one of these conversations. We mentioned a lot of great groups. There's so many more, but we talked about Texas Advanced Energy Business Alliance. Look up their stuff. You mentioned Pecan Street, awesome. Clean Tech's great group. I want to throw in another one that I hope everybody will take a look at. The Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute. Dana Harmon, their excellent executive director, put out a great blog post, which hopefully we can link to in whatever we send out after this, about the effect of this event on low and middle income folks. Look, what's the number, Joseph? You probably, something like 40% of Texans don't have $1,000 in the bank or something like that, right? I mean,
not even that. It's a great majority of Texans don't even have $250 for an emergency repair, whether it be a tire or a hot water heater, and that is a real tragedy.
So I think when we're thinking about these things and we're talking about energy efficiency retrofits, we got to prioritize these folks. We got to help them get their houses in shape. And like you said earlier, it's not just something good to do. It's not just that it'll reduce demand and help keep our grid reliable. It's not just that it'll put people to work. It's not just those things. It's a matter of life and death. And we would be wrong if we forgot that in the summertime, it gets crazy hot here. There was a great series done by Gatehouse Media, The Statesman, on the number of people that died in their homes in the summertime from electric shutoffs. We've got to keep people in mind that are going to have the hardest time dealing with climate change because they don't have the resources to do it. And we've got to figure out how we can use the levers of government to help those people. And that can't be lost in this, especially as we're talking about this uplift to the market and everybody paying for it. There's a lot of people that $50 or $100, that means the difference between getting medicine or food this month, and we cannot let that happen. Those people cannot pay this bill.
Yeah. Lee brings up a good point here at the very end, though, which is just to what level do we want government to be more involved? And, he says it's tough for those of us who want less regulation to show up, tell our reps that we want them to do less of their good ideas. So vote for your patrons, vote for your dollars. So, what does that look like? Where do we draw the line in terms of understanding how much of this is rugged individualism? Everybody's got to do their own thing, with what you talked about, which is, these energy companies have said, well, we got $2.8 billion we don't have, so we're going to spread it out over everybody, which is a communal, some people call it socialism, but other people call it a shared distribution of the resources that we have. Any last thoughts on that? Because this will come up apparently going forward in a special session.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I'd welcome talking with whoever that was that just wrote in. Let's keep this discussion going on LinkedIn. But let me just say this: if it's not clear to folks after this event that robust regulation of the free market is important, I'm not sure what's going to convince you. I'm reading a book right now, which I recommend to everybody, called Ministry for the Future. It's a fictional account of what the world will be like in the 2030s as the climate continues. Right, we're 2 degrees Fahrenheit now. As we get to 3 and 4, what does that actually look like? There's a great line by the author Kim Stanley Robinson in that book where he says, "The invisible hand of the market never picks up the check."
Boom!
Who does pick up the check? You and me.
Do.
Yeah.
So we're going to end right there. What a brilliant quote. I want to thank everybody who tuned in here. We're ending at the top of the hour. My name is Joseph Kopser. Today, my guest has been Doug Lewin, president of the Stoic Climate Energy Group. And my goodness, to say that the hidden hand never picks up the check is a perfect way to end this. Let's stay connected on LinkedIn, and let me know any questions or comments. Thanks a lot, Doug.
Thank you, Joseph. This was fun.
Take care.
You too.